Well, I am very grateful for this opportunity to share with you what is basically, I like to think of it as a draft chapter on forests for an environmental history book on Afghanistan that I'm slowly putting together. And my focus will be on the forests and forest products of the Hindu Kush region. I will give a long-term kind of environmental history of this region, touching upon borders and religions and the use of timber. I want to say that environmental history forces historians to think beyond the nation state to chronologies and geographies that are much deeper and wider than the boundaries of the nation states we take for granted today. Let me see if I can make this screen move. And the Hindu Kush is one spur of a larger mountain range, the Himalayas. And the Hindu Kush is a defining feature of Afghanistan. In environmental history terms, Afghanistan is best thought about not through its borders, but through the Hindu Kush, through the Indus and Oxus rivers, upon which the cultural influences of Iran, India, and Islam give Afghanistan its overall profile and cultural disposition today. I have tried to give you a larger map of the Himalayas here, of Afghanistan here, the Hindu Kush being kind of the spine of Afghanistan. The focus on forests will take us to the northeast region and the eastern region of Afghanistan as we get moving today. I'd like to begin with the products, the mountain and forest products of the Hindu Kush that have been circulating globally for millennia. Lapis lazuli is a world-renowned product of the Hindu Kush that the Egyptian pharaohs consumed greatly, the pyramids and Queen Cleopatra. And of course, the process of mining and transporting lapis involves timber and lumber in direct ways, but more directly, cedar from the forests of the Hindu Kush cycled through the Indus Valley civilization in sustained and systematic ways for multiple centuries, beginning about the 3rd millennia BC. So we have a really deep history of mountain commodities to track. In terms of religion, I'd like to emphasize Zoroastrianism's connection to the Hindu Kush region and the role of trees in Zoroastrianism in particular. This is the Sabze Abarko, the cypress tea of Kashmir, which is one of the world's oldest trees, dated between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. That the legend says this is a tree that Zoroaster brought from paradise and gave to the king Vishtapa for founding the first fire temple. And Zoroastrianism really amplifies the sort of sacredness of evergreen trees. And we must position Zoroaster, the historical figure, in northern Afghanistan, Balkh or Mazar-e-Sharif today. And of course, trees from the Hindu Kush inform that region. In South Asia, the Hindu Kush forests are intimately connected to the the Vedas as a body of literature and the religions that sprung from the Vedas, including Buddhism and Hinduism. In particular, the cedar tree is the tree of the gods and becomes a really ingrained aspect of Vedic lore, particularly around the figure of Shiva and Shiva's consort or wife, Parvati, and Durga, sometimes called Kali, and their son Ganesha, the elephant-headed one we can see over here. The point is that cedar wood and cedar forests have high prominence in the Vedas. Trees as a whole, many different types of trees also figure into Ayurvedic medicine historically. So branches, roots, stems, leaves from a variety of trees have a really high symbolically elaborated and kind of medical technologies built around trees. In Islam, Islam has a deep connection to mountains and trees. First of all, Jabal al-Nur, the mountain of light, where Muhammad received the revelation from the angel Jibril in the cave Hira. The Quran has about dozens of references, particularly to the date palm, both for food, but also the foliage for roofing. Many other trees are mentioned in the hadiths of Islam. The tamarisk tree, pomegranate tree, the fig tree, the olive tree is particularly noted for its medicinal purposes. And I mention this about Islam because Islam comes to Afghanistan and grafts its tree consciousness and culture onto existing tree and mountain cultures. When Islam meets Afghanistan in about the 10th century AD, about 1,000 years ago, where in Afghanistan, two Islamic dynasties, the Ghaznavid and Ghurid dynasties, built monuments, and there's a very important place for wood in the architecture, sacred architecture of Islam, mosques and shrines, we can see up in the right, but also for structural features of minarets involving both the skeleton of the kind of frame of the structure itself, but also stairways, door frames, the pulpit or mihrabs of Islam have wooden features to them. And the presence of Islam in Afghanistan in the 10th century AD also is the birth of Persian as a modern language. Ferdowsi was patronized at the court of the Ghaznavids and produced the Shahnama, which is the world's longest epic poem, and it has a tremendous amount of attention to trees, including the cypress tree of Kashmir we mentioned for Zoroastrianism, and here the wakwak tree that Skander found at the end of his travels, at the end of the world, with two trunks and two sets of male and female talking heads that foretold of Skandar's death. Really important role for trees and Persianate culture. Coming to about the year 1500, the founder of the Mughal Empire, Babur, made his name in Kabul and spent about 20 years, formative years in his life, in and around Kabul and the Hindu Kush before founding the Mughal Empire. And we see here his grave in Kabul. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, is buried in Kabul. This is a chinar tree, a birch tree that is in the 1950s, was in that garden. Babur left for us an autobiography called the Babur Nama that was sort of translated from Turkish into Persian and illustrated by the grandson, perhaps the greatest Mughal ruler, Akbar. And the illustrations of the Babur Nama bring an environmental history of the Hindu Kush to life in so many different ways, with discussions of animals, plants, flowers, rivers, fish, the smells, dust, wind. All the elements of an environmental history are provided to us in the Babur Nama. And Babur gives us a really excellent description of Kabul's wood culture. Which woods burn best when they're wet, which woods burn longest, which woods produce the best ashes, what is the best wood for nighttime, kind of a torch, So a tremendous amount of information about Kabul's wood culture. A number of other really specific trees. This tree near Peshawar, Babur visited. And this tree is a couple of thousand, a banyan tree near Peshawar. A number of other trees in the Mughal sphere. The Mughals maintained a very intense interest in the Hindu Kush region. And in fact, Humayun was born in Kabul and Kandahar cycled between the Mughals and Safavids. There's a tremendous amount of environmental information from the Mughal era on the Hindu Kush. I want to just put this out here to emphasize Babur's intimate details of these trees of the Hindu Kush and their plants, the various wines from various grapes, which regions have the best wines, drugs, kind of medicines from plants. It's just it's such a wonderful resource and underutilized as far as I can tell. Jumping to colonialism, the most important aspect of British colonialism is deforestation of the Himalayas for railroad building purposes. And cedar wood, the cedar forests of the Himalayas were depleted in extraordinary volumes to produce the railroad sleepers, the ties that go between the metal rods. In addition, British imperial forestry developed in relationship to railroads and the commercial exploitation of forests. And this is a picture of the Imperial Forest Institute, the National Forest Institute of India today, and it's a World Wood Library. That's a fascinating resource for Himalayan wood products. The British were into the Himalayas and Hindu Kush for commercial and political reasons, but also scientific reasons. So there's considerable mapping of the glaciers, of the passes, of the languages of the Hindu Kush region that again offers students and scholars a wealth of resources. The British engagement of Afghanistan is marked by two wars. The first war roughly in 1840, the second war roughly in 1880. Leading up to the first war, the British produced the first kind of modern maps of the Hindu Kush. On the left, we see the map from Mount Stuart Elphinstone's, an account of the Kingdom of Kabul, perhaps the first and most famous colonial monograph on Afghanistan, where the mountains of the Hindu Kush are mapped in a way that is very different from a similar map produced at the same time, based upon the same data, with a very different result. The point to emphasize here in these different maps using the same data for the same region is the inconsistencies and the contradictions and gaps in colonial knowledge of forests and really anything. Colonialism is not a stable body of knowledge. It's full of a lot of problematic relationships between data. The second war in Afghanistan really brings what we think of Afghanistan into vision today. Afghanistan as we know it, with its borders, with a great deal of alienation between state and society, begins with the ruler Abdul Rahman, who is positioned as a British appointee and a recipient of British subsidies in 1880. Abdul Rahman used British subsidies to develop an industrial, a kind of set of industrial workshops. He hired English technocrats and bought a lot of English industrial equipment for these workshops. This is all steam-driven industrial material. And this steam workshop complex resulted in rapid deforestation of the eastern regions of Afghanistan. Abdul Rahman instituted commodity monopolies over timber to fuel the machine khana. And the commodity monopoly that Abdul Rahman established was in the region of Parun, Afghanistan, in Kafiristan, what is known as Kafiristan. Kafiristan became known as Nuristan when it was forcibly Islamized by Abdul Rahman in 1896. Kafiristan has been an object of colonial fascination, Afghan state fascination, and international fascination. We begin with British sort of paintings and lithographs, later photographs of the Kafir slaves who have been converted, the furniture of this region that enters the international art market, the wildlife of this region that brings in international conservationists, the language mapping of this region. The point is that Kafiristan has absorbed disproportionate amount of ethnographic attention in Afghanistan, which has led to Kafiristan being sort of defined as the region where there's a wood culture in Afghanistan. And we see this architecture that really does amplify the wood basis of this cultural zone in Afghanistan. And I'd like to just build upon that very briefly here with reference to the timber, various woods used for the construction of both houses, tombs, patios, and porches. And again, I must highlight up in the left, wine drinking is a big part of this region. The wood culture takes form in the idols, in the posts and pillars, rafters, beams, furniture, and doorways of these structures, all of which, a lot of this material has ended up in the Kabul Museum and international art markets. I'm interested in the craftsmen, the woodworkers, their organization, their training, their networks, their tools and technologies, and the role of blacksmiths is very important for these woodworkers because of metal tools. But I'm most interested in the loggers, in the lumberjacks, and their social organization, their hierarchies, their labor regimes are really the focus of my interest. The Germans were instrumental in establishing the British Forestry School. Dietrich Brandeis was a German who served the British in India. The German interest in this region takes shape in 1935 with the Dutch Hindu Kush expedition that was sent by the German government in search of the original plants for the original Aryan populations, a kind of genetic history of the Aryans. And so even this German mission really emphasized a kind of wood culture, although it was more or less a botanical expedition. A number of international expeditions emphasized the wood culture of this region. And I'm here to say Afghanistan as a whole is a wood culture region. There is no region, there's no population in Afghanistan that is not dependent upon wood for architecture, heating, fuel, or aesthetic purposes. And in a sense, the reduction of wood culture to Kafiristan has misled scholars about the role of wood elsewhere in the country. We see evidence of a robust Kabul wood market that sort of is a modern day echo of Babur. And so the modern markets for Hindu Kush timber are something we need to keep in mind. Okay. In the 20th century, there's a good deal of international travel to Afghanistan. We have here, again, another German, Niedermeyer, who took a number of pictures throughout the country, emphasizing the wood culture here of Kabul's architecture before Kabul became a sort of cement steel city. It was a lumber, wood, and brick city. Now, in the middle century, the Americans are involved in Afghanistan beginning in the 40s. And what the Americans notice is a transboundary timber trade. And what this report indicates is an agreement between the Afghan government and a ruler in British India for the transport of 10,000 logs down the Kunar River. The point is that the river begins in British India, comes through Afghanistan, and then goes back to British India. And now we're talking about transboundary commodity flows that speak to the problems of boundaries in this region. After World War II. Yeah.
We are also already on 20 minutes.
I'll take just a couple more minutes, okay?
Okay.
Just a couple more minutes.
Try to sum it up.
Yep. The issue of Pashtunistan brought in a lot of international development. Again, Western Germans in the region of Paktia went through a big forestry effort that came to naught because the Soviets ended up napalming this region. The Americans have been brutalizing the forests of the Hindu Kush, beginning with the Tora Bora campaign in December 2001, leading up to the mother of all bombs in April 2017. For 20 years, there has been a relentless bombardment of the Hindu Kush, its natural and human environment. The most devastating consequence of the American presence from aerial bombardment to military bases is toxins, depleted uranium from munitions, and the toxicity of military bases. Military bases that are structured by the human terrain teams and provincial reconstruction teams that have polluted the environment and securitized and militarized the attention to the wood trade that's tied to counterinsurgency. And we have basically the timber trade in from the American perspective tied to insurgencies. And the greatest threat to all this is the water supply. Radiation in the groundwater of Afghanistan will render the Hindu Kush uninhabitable in the long run. And that is a war crime. And I ask for international scholarly attention to this absolute catastrophe. Thank you very much.